My name is Solange Vaillancourt, and I am 73 years old, and I am recording this in the kitchen of the house my mother left me on a Tuesday morning in the third week of October, because the aspens at the far edge of the property turned gold last night, and I have been sitting at this window since before the sun came up, watching the tree line the way my mother used to. And I understood this morning that if I do not say what I know out loud to someone before the snow comes, then what happened here will be no more permanent than the frost on the glass, which is already beginning to clear. My mother's name was Odette Fortier. She was born in 1921 in a village on the Gatineau River called Lac Cayamant, the third daughter of a man who set trap lines and a woman who kept bees. She was 21 years old when she married Fernand Sauvé in the spring of 1942, in the small Catholic church that still stands in the village, though it has not been a working church since I was a girl. Fernand was 24, a lumber inspector with the Provincial Forestry Office, a man I know only through a single photograph that hung in my mother's bedroom until the day she died, and through what she chose to tell me in the last autumn of her life, which is what I am trying to set down now. They had 3 years together, Odette and Fernand. 3 years and 7 months to be exact, because my mother was always exact about this. He was posted to a survey camp north of Maniwaki in the late summer of 1945, a temporary assignment that was supposed to last 6 weeks, to assess timber losses from an unusual beetle infestation along a stretch of crown land above the Coulanges watershed. He wrote to my mother twice in September. He did not write in October. The camp supervisor sent a note in November saying that Fernand Sauvé had been last seen leaving the survey camp on foot on the 14th of October, intending to walk a marked trail to the river and back. He did not come back. They searched for 10 days. They found his pack on the bank of a creek that runs into the Coulanges about 4 miles north of where the camp stood. They found his compass in the mud. They did not find Fernand. My mother waited 2 years before she accepted that he was not coming back. Those are her words, and I have thought about them for all the years since she spoke them to me. She did not say she waited 2 years before she accepted that he was dead. She said she waited 2 years before she accepted that he was not coming back. The distinction mattered to her. She explained it to me only once, that October evening on the back step, and she was precise about it, the way she was precise about everything. She said that a man can be dead and still be expected, still be listened for in the particular silence of a house that used to hold him, still be something you save half of the stove's heat for without thinking. She had continued for 2 years to keep the house in a state of readiness that was not hope exactly, and was not denial exactly, but was the simple refusal to close a door, before she was certain nothing was coming through it. She had kept his shaving cup on the shelf above the basin. She had left his work boots near the door. She had told no one she was doing this. It was not something that required an explanation, because it was not something she had decided. In the winter of 1946, she received a letter from the provincial ministry, a form letter more or less, with his name filled in by hand in the appropriate blanks, informing her that the search had been officially concluded and that her husband was presumed dead, and that she should contact the ministry office in Hull regarding his pension benefits and the disposition of his personal effects that had been recovered from the camp, which amounted to a trunk of clothing, a pair of field binoculars, and a surveyor's log with entries from July through the 9th of October. The letter had been signed by a clerk whose name she could not read clearly. She did not contact the ministry office right away. She sat with the letter on the kitchen table for a week, going to her work at the general store in the morning and coming home in the evening. And she did not tell her mother about the letter, because her mother was not well that winter, and the telling would not have helped anything. She contacted the ministry in February. She received the trunk and the binoculars and the surveyor's log. She read the log once and put it in the trunk and put the trunk in the back of the shed under a piece of canvas, and did not go to the shed for the rest of that winter. In the spring of 1947, a full year after the ministry letter, she took the shaving cup off the shelf. She did not throw it away. She put it in the trunk with the other things, and she took the work boots from beside the door and put those in the trunk as well, and she dragged the trunk out of the shed and put it on the bed of a neighbour's wagon and sent it to the church charity. She kept the photograph of Fernand on the wall of her bedroom, and she kept the surveyor's log in the trunk that she did not send away, because the log had his handwriting in it, and she was not ready for that. She came to the Laurentians in the spring of 1948, because her father's older brother had land near the town of Val-de-Lacs, and he was aging and needed someone to help with the property and the animals, and Odette needed somewhere to be that was not the village where everyone knew Fernand's name. She was 26 years old. She came with a trunk, a set of gardening tools, and the photograph of Fernand from the wall of her bedroom, which she put in the trunk and did not take out again, not for a very long time. Her uncle's name was Honoré Fortier. He was 68 years old, a lean and slow-moving man who had lived alone on 40 acres of mixed land since his wife died of pneumonia in 1932, and who had never had children, and had perhaps forgotten, or perhaps never fully learned, the accommodation of another person's rhythms in a shared house. He was not unkind. He was simply very accustomed to silence, and to things being where he had put them, and to the stove being fed at the particular hours he had always fed it. My mother said he watched her those first weeks the way a man watches a new horse. He is not sure he trusts, not with hostility, but with a measuring patience that she found, after a while, restful. It asked nothing of her. It simply waited to see what she was. She settled into the house carefully, taking up as little space as she could manage, learning his schedule and working inside it. She cleaned and cooked and tended the kitchen garden, and fed the 2 horses and the dozen hens that were the property's animals, and she mended the fence line on the north field which had come apart over the winter, and she cut the grass in the yard with a scythe, because Honoré's scythe was good, but he could no longer manage the whole yard in a single day. She wrote to her parents on Sundays. She did not tell them she was not sleeping. The property sat in a fold of land between a long ridge to the east and a shallow valley to the west, and the house faced south, and at the far northern edge of the property the land ran up against the spruce forest which came down off the ridge, and which had stood there as far as anyone on the property had ever known, without interruption. Honoré had planted the aspens himself as a young man, in a long row along the northern boundary of the cleared land, partly as windbreak and partly because he liked them, and they had grown thick and close over the decades until you could not see clearly into the spruce behind them, except in winter, when the aspens lost their leaves and the forest behind them became visible in the thin grey light, and even then it was not clarity so much as depth, a depth of dark trees going back and back until the light failed. My mother said she had not paid much attention to the tree line that summer. She had been busy and tired, and she had not been, she said, the sort of person who watches tree lines. She was a person who watched what was directly in front of her, what needed doing, and she watched that with care and got it done. And that was enough. In October, the aspens turned, and the turning of them was something she had not been prepared for, because it was the same turning she had watched from a different window, in a different place, in a different life, and the sameness of it undid something in her that the change of province, and the change of house, and the change of occupation had not undone. My father, Marcel Vaillancourt, was a man who kept a woodlot on the eastern slope of a ridge, about 6 kilometers from her uncle's property, and he came to help with the fence line in the summer of 1949, and they married in the spring of 1950. I was born in February of 1952, the first of their 4 children. My father was a solid, gentle, quiet man who never spoke badly of anyone, and whose opinions, when he offered them, arrived slow and deliberate, as stones being set in a wall. I loved him completely, and I miss him in the daily, practical way I miss good weather. He died in 1991. I tell you all of this so that you understand the shape of the life my mother lived before she told me what she told me. It was the autumn of 1998. I had driven up from Ottawa to spend a week with her, as I did every October, because October was when my mother needed company most, and also when she was most unwilling to ask for it. She was 77 years old and she was well, she was sharp, but I noticed that year that she had begun to arrange things. The photograph of Fernand had come out of the trunk and was sitting on the kitchen table, propped against the sugar bowl. That was unusual enough that I sat down and looked at it carefully for the first time. He was a thin, light-haired man in a forestry uniform, standing in front of a stand of birch trees with one hand shielding his eyes from the sun, and a slight smile that suggested he was embarrassed to be photographed, but was trying to be agreeable about it. He looked kind. He looked like a man who would be embarrassed to be photographed. I asked her why she had taken the photograph out of the trunk, and she looked at me for a moment with that particular expression she had, which was the expression of a woman deciding whether you are ready to hear something. And then she said quietly that she thought it was time for Fernand to sit at the table. I did not know what she meant by that. I thought it was sentiment, the harmless settling of old grief, and I let it be. That night, we had supper, and afterward, she went to sit on the back step, the way she always did in the evening when the weather allowed, looking out toward the aspen stand at the far edge of the property, which her uncle had planted in a long, ragged row in 1935, and which by 1998 had grown into something approaching a small forest. I brought her a cup of tea and sat down beside her, and we were quiet together for a while, the way people who have known each other all their lives can be quiet. And then she said, without turning her head, that she wanted to tell me something about the autumn she spent at her uncle's place in 1948, the first autumn, before she knew my father. I said that I was listening. She said it had been a dry autumn, the driest in her memory, and the aspens had gone gold very early before the middle of September, and she had been awake most nights because she was not sleeping well in those years, because of the loss of Fernand and the strangeness of the new place, and the fact that grief, she said, does not respect a schedule. She had been in the habit of sitting at the window of her bedroom, which faced east toward the ridge, and watching the dark the way you watch it when you cannot sleep, not expecting anything, just looking at the shape of the night. She said the first time she saw him, she thought she was seeing a shadow thrown by the moon through the trees. This was in the second week of October, nearly 3 years to the month since Fernand had walked out of the survey camp and not come back. She was sitting at the window around 2 in the morning, and the moon was nearly full and the aspens were gold and still, and at the far edge of the property where the aspens meet the spruce, something stood up that had been crouching there. She said it stood. She said she was watching the tree line, the place where the aspens end and the dark spruce forest begins, and something at that boundary rose slowly to its full height. And its full height was considerable, and it was not a shadow. It was a thing of great size, and it stood perfectly still, and it was looking, with what she could only describe as patience, toward the house. She did not go to get her uncle. She did not light a lamp. She sat at the window and she looked back at it the way it was looking at the house, quietly and without rushing, and she said that, after a while, she did not know how long, it turned and walked into the spruce forest and was gone, and she sat at the window until the sky began to lighten, and then she went and made tea. She did not tell her uncle. She did not tell anyone. She thought it was something she had imagined, and she was already aware in 1948 that she was a woman who had recently lost a husband and had come alone to a place where she knew almost no one, and she had no interest in being the sort of woman who sees things. She came back to the window the next night. It was there again. Same position, same patience. Standing at the edge of the aspens facing the house. The moon had shifted and she could see it a little better, and she said what she understood that second night, sitting at the window in her uncle's spare room, was that it was not watching the house. It was watching the window. It was watching her. I have thought about what she told me next for 25 years, and I have still not found the right language for it. She said that after the second night, she stopped being afraid. She said fear was what she felt at first, in the first seconds of the first sighting, the way you might feel fear at anything large and unexpected. But it went away quickly and did not come back, because she said there was something about the quality of the attention, the way it held still, the way it seemed to have no urgency, no demand, no intention to come closer than the tree line. She said it felt, as she sat at the window, the way it feels to be recognized by someone in a crowd when you did not expect to be recognized and were not sure you wanted to be, but find, in the moment of recognition, that you are glad. She came back to the window every night for the rest of that October. It came to the tree line on 11 of those nights. Not every night. Not on any schedule she could identify. But it came. And she sat at the window. And they kept company across the open ground between the house and the aspens. And she said that by the end of the month, she had begun to understand that it was not threatening her, and was not watching her out of hunger or curiosity in the way a predator is curious, but was keeping watch over her. The way, she said, you keep watch over someone who is asleep in a house you are not permitted to enter. I asked her that October evening in 1998 if she had ever been certain about what it was. She picked up her cup of tea and held it in both hands and looked out at the aspens, which had gone gold again because it was October, and they always went gold in October, and she said carefully that she had come to believe it was connected to Fernand. She let that sit between us for a moment. She said she did not mean that it was Fernand. She wanted to be clear about that. She was not a woman who confused the living with the dead or the human with the other than human, and she had no interest in being understood to be making that kind of claim. What she meant, she said, was that the forest north of Maniwaki, where Fernand had walked away from the survey camp in October of 1945, was a forest, and whatever was keeping watch at the tree line was from the forest, and it had come to her in October, which was the month of his going, and she had never been able to stop herself from believing that there was a connection between those facts, even if she could not name what the connection was. I asked her what she meant by a connection. She said that the forest keeps records that we do not, that there are things in the deep woods that know what happens in them, the way a river knows the shape of its bed, not as an act of memory, but as a fact of being. She said that what found her at the tree line in October of 1948 had come from the same country where Fernand had gone. She did not believe it was his spirit. She believed it was a witness. I did not know what to say to that. I am a practical woman. I taught secondary school mathematics in Ottawa for 31 years, and I have always been most comfortable with quantities and proofs. But I was sitting next to my 77-year-old mother on the back step of the house where she had spent the majority of her life, and the aspens at the edge of the property were gold in the fading light, and she was perfectly calm and perfectly clear, and I had no reason to disbelieve her. She married my father in the spring of 1950. She did not tell him what had happened at the window, not that year, not for many years. She said she tried to find the right words for it several times in those early years of their marriage, and each time the words came out either too small or too large, either too much like a ghost story or too much like a confession. And she put it away. She told him in 1961. She told him 13 years later because that was the autumn it came back. She was sitting in the kitchen one evening in the 3rd week of October, the year I was 9, and she looked out the window towards the aspens in the dark, and she said she felt certain, in the way you feel certain about things you cannot explain, that it was there. She went to the window. It was there, same place, same patience, same quality of attention. She stood at the kitchen window for a long time, and then she called my father in from the other room. He came and stood beside her and looked where she was looking, and was quiet for a while, and then he said very quietly that he saw it. She told him everything that night, the whole story, including Fernand, including the window in 1948. She said he listened without interrupting, which was the way my father always listened. And when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said that he was glad she had told him, and that the woods were full of things that did not have names, and that he did not require a name for this one to believe it. He asked her one question. He asked her whether she was afraid of it. She said she told him no, she had not been afraid of it since the 2nd night, and he nodded and said good, because fear was the thing that made people do foolish things about whatever they were afraid of, and this was something that did not deserve anyone doing foolish things about it. That is all he said. He did not press her for an explanation. He did not suggest that what she had seen might have been a bear or a trick of the light, because my father was a man who had spent 30 years in and around the forest, and he knew what bears looked like, and he knew what tricks of the light looked like, and he had seen the thing at the window with his own eyes. He added the information to his understanding of the world, the way he added every piece of information, which was slowly and carefully and without drama. And once he had added it, he did not feel a need to revisit it. I was 9 years old. I was asleep. They did not tell me. I understand now why they did not tell me. I am the mother of a daughter myself, and I know the calculus of it, the question of when a child can be trusted with something that requires of them a particular kind of holding, a particular kind of stillness. I was a curious child, talkative, prone to asking adults questions they had not prepared to answer. And what my parents carried was not a thing that would have survived a curious child's questions intact. I do not resent them for keeping it. I have thought about how I might have handled it at 9 years old, and I think I might have gone to the Treeline to look. I think they were right to wait. I grew up in a house that kept something, and children know when a house keeps something, even if they do not know what it is. I remember from that winter watching my parents at the kitchen table after supper and having the feeling that they were sitting differently than they had sat before, not in any way I could name, nothing that would have been visible to anyone outside our family, but differently, the way two people sit when they have arrived together at a shared understanding that has weight to it. My father had always been a quiet man, but that winter his quiet had a different quality, a quality of knowing, and my mother, who had always looked toward the window in the evenings, now looked toward it with something more deliberate in her posture, something that was not quite waiting and was not quite remembering, but was somewhere between the two. It came back in 1968 and again in 1974. My mother kept a small notebook in the drawer of her bedside table, a brown cardboard-covered notebook that I found when I was settling her house after she died, and in it she had recorded each visit in her careful, slanted hand. The date, the weather, the duration, whether it had come alone or whether she had sensed, which was her word, sensed that there were others in the trees behind it. The first entry was from October of 1948, and it was longer than the others, 3 pages, written in a hand slightly less controlled than her usual hand, as if the writing had happened in some agitation of spirit. Though the words themselves were not agitated, they were very precise. She described the position at the tree line, the approximate distance from the house, the quality of the moonlight, the duration of both the first and second nights. She wrote that it had the form of a very large man but was not a man, and that she understood this clearly and had no need to revisit the question. She wrote that its eyes, when the moon caught them, were dark and without threat. She wrote that she had not told her uncle. The subsequent entries were shorter. A date, a temperature if she knew it, sometimes a moon phase, a note on whether it had come early in the night or later, a note on whether she had gone to the window or simply looked from where she sat. She was consistent about duration, always recording how long it stayed, measured against whatever clock was available to her. She had a restrained instinct for measurement that I recognize as her own, and that I believe I have inherited because I have kept my own entries in the same notebook, in the same form since 1999. In 1968, she wrote that she sensed others. This was the entry I found most difficult to read, not because she wrote it with distress, but because she wrote it without distress, in the same even and factual register as everything else, as if the presence of others behind the tree line was simply a piece of information she wished to record accurately. She wrote that she had not seen them but had understood they were there, and that the one who stood at the tree line had turned its head once, briefly, to the left, as if acknowledging something behind it, and that was when she understood. She wrote that she had stayed at the window until they were gone, and then had gone back to bed and slept better than she had slept in some weeks. In 1974, she wrote that it came alone, and that it stood for a long time, and that when it turned to go, it paused once, at the edge of the spruce, and looked back over its shoulder at the house. And she had the impression, she wrote, of something finishing, something set in order, though she could not say what. I have thought about that entry from 1974 many times. I was 22 years old in 1974, living in Ottawa, studying for the teaching certificate I was trying to finish in 2 years, instead of 3, because I needed the income. I was not thinking about the tree line. I was thinking about lesson plans and about the man I was seeing at the time who would not become my husband, and about the cost of winter boots. My parents did not call to tell me it had come. They did not call because they had made no agreement about when they would tell me, having still not decided whether to tell me at all. I was not angry about this when I found out. I understood it. But I have wondered sometimes what I would have done differently in that autumn if I had known what was standing at the edge of the property in October, looking back at the house over its shoulder as if setting something in order. My father died in 1991. My mother told me afterward that she had written in the notebook on the evening of the day he died, not because it had come to the tree line that day, but because she wanted to record that she had gone to the window on her own and stood there and said out loud into the dark that Marcel Vaillancourt was a good man, a patient and gentle and decent man who had shared her life and her secret for 30 years and had never once asked her to explain what she could not explain. She said she felt that whatever was out there in the dark, and the aspens deserved to know that. She did not know if it heard her. She told me all of this on the back step, and when she finished she was quiet for a moment, and then she said she wanted me to look at the aspens. I looked, and I tell you plainly, because I am 73 years old, and I did not drive 3 hours from Ottawa to sit at this window and look at the gold aspens in the morning light without being willing to tell you what I know. I saw it. It was at the tree line, at the boundary between the planted aspens and the old spruce forest beyond, which is very old and very dark, and which has been there since long before my mother's uncle planted the aspens, since long before anyone in our family touched this land. It stood at that boundary, very still, and it was larger than anything I have a name for, and it was looking toward us in the way my mother had described, which was with patience and without demand, the quality of attention you give to something you have come to see without expecting to receive anything in return. We sat on the back step and we looked at it, and it stood at the tree line and it was still, and the aspens made a small sound in the evening wind, and the light went slowly out of the sky. After a while, and I could not tell you how long, it moved. Not quickly, not with alarm, just the way something large and unhurried moves when it has finished what it came to do. It turned back into the spruce forest and was gone, and the tree line was a tree line again, and my mother picked up her cup of tea and found it was cold, and said she would go in and warm it on the stove. I sat on the step for a while longer by myself. She died in March of 1999, 5 months after that evening. She was 77 years old. She died in this house, in her own bed, on a morning when the snow was coming down fine and steady outside the bedroom window. And what she said in the last hours was not dramatic. She said she was tired, and she said she was glad I was there, and she said that the notebook was in the bedside drawer and that I should keep it, that it was mine now. I found the notebook. I have read it many times. The last entry she made was dated October 18th, 1998, which was 3 days before she told me about the window and 2 days after the evening on the back step. And what she wrote was brief. She wrote that it had come again. She wrote the weather, which was clear and cool, and the duration, which was approximately 40 minutes. And then she wrote, in her careful, slanted hand, that she believed now that it would continue to come, that it was not tied to her specifically, but to the place, and perhaps to the season, and perhaps to something that happened in the forest north of Maniwaki in October of 1945, that no human being was present to witness, and that whoever held the notebook after her should know that and should not be afraid. She was right that I should not be afraid. I have been coming to this house every October since she died. My brother Gilles comes sometimes, but he prefers to come in the summer, and my sisters both moved south years ago and do not make the drive easily anymore. I come alone, which is fine. I am not uncomfortable alone. I have a dog named Biscuit, an old beige mixed breed of uncertain ancestry, who sleeps near the stove and understands that in October we sit at windows. It came in October of 2001 and again in October of 2006. I recorded both visits in my mother's notebook, in my own handwriting, which is less careful than hers but recognizable as the same family. In 2006, I brought my daughter Isabel, who was 22 years old and studying environmental sciences at the University of Ottawa. And I told her the whole story over 2 evenings. And on the 3rd evening, she sat at the window with me. And she was very quiet, and she asked good questions, the kinds of questions a person asks when they are taking something seriously. She did not see it that visit. She was not discouraged. She said she would come back. She came back in October of 2011, and again in 2017. In 2011, she saw it. She was standing at the kitchen window just after 9 in the evening, because I had told her it had never, in any entry my mother recorded or in my own experience, come before dark, and she had taken this seriously the way she took most things seriously, which was completely. I was sitting at the table behind her with my tea, and I heard her go still, a quality of stillness that is not the ordinary stillness of a person standing at a window, but the stillness of someone who has stopped breathing for a moment without deciding to stop. And then she said, very quietly, that it was there. I went and stood beside her. It was there. It was farther along the tree line than it usually stood, a little to the left of where it had stood in 1948, in 1961, in 1998, and it was large, and it was very still. And the moon that night was not full, but was near enough to full that the aspens cast shadows on the frost-pale grass. And at the boundary of those shadows, the thing stood with its face, if you could call it a face, turned toward the house. I could see, even at that distance, even in that light, the quality of attention my mother had described to me 50 years after she had first sat at a window and tried to name it. The patience, the quality of looking that asked nothing and missed nothing. Isabel stood at the window for a long time without speaking. When it finally moved, turning back into the spruce with that unhurried deliberateness, she let out a long, slow breath, and then she turned to look at me, and her face was not frightened and was not incredulous and was not exhilarated in the way people's faces sometimes are when they expect to be. And what it was instead was serious, the face of a person who has just understood the full weight of something they had previously only held in outline. She called me from the step afterward, where she had gone to stand by herself for a moment, and I could hear in her voice the specific texture of a thing that has been large in the imagination, becoming, against all expectation, larger in reality. She was 27 years old, and she was not a woman given to sentiment, and she stood on the step, and she said, quietly, that she understood now why my mother had kept the notebook. She has a notebook of her own. She started it that same night, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, writing in the careful, factual way that I have written and that my mother wrote before me. The date and the weather and the duration and the quality of the moon. She asked me to read it when she was done, which I did, and her handwriting is larger than mine and less slanted than my mother's, but the form of the entries is the same. The information is the same. The restraint is the same. I do not know how that happens. The passing of a particular way of carrying a thing from one person to the next, across generations. I do not know whether it is learned or inherited, or simply the natural result of taking something seriously enough that you cannot treat it any other way. But I recognize the notebook Isabel keeps, and I recognized it the first time I read it, as the same notebook my mother kept and that I keep now. And I think my mother would have recognized it too. I think about Fernand Sauvé sometimes, the thin man in the photograph with the forestry uniform and the slight, embarrassed smile, standing in front of the birch trees with one hand shielding his eyes. I think about the 14 days of searching in the October forest north of Maniwaki, the pack on the creek bank, the compass in the mud, the things they did not find. I think about what my mother said, that the forest keeps records we do not, that there are things in the deep woods that know what happens in them the way a river knows its bed. I do not know what happened to Fernand Sauvé. No one knows. I know that something large and patient and very old has been coming to the tree line at the edge of this property in October for more than 70 years, and that it came first to my mother in her grief, and that it came back after she married my father, and that it came back after he died, and that it has come to me and to my daughter, and that I believe it will come to whoever is sitting at the window of this house after we are gone, as long as the spruce forest stands behind the aspens and the aspens go gold in October the way they always go gold, the way they are going gold right now as I look at them through the kitchen window in the early morning light. I asked my mother that last October on the back step whether she had ever tried to explain it to herself, whether she had settled on any understanding of what it was and why it came. She thought for a moment, holding her cold cup of tea, and then she said no. She said she had stopped trying to explain it a long time ago, sometime in her 40s, when she had understood that the explaining was its own kind of fear, a way of keeping it manageable, a way of making it smaller so that she could contain it. And She had decided she did not need to contain it. She decided she could let it be as large as it was. She said this without sadness. I was at the kitchen window before 6 o'clock this morning, while it was still dark, the way my mother used to be, and Biscuit was on his blanket near the stove, and the aspens were invisible, but I could hear them in the wind. I made tea and I sat with it, and I waited for the light, the way you wait for the light in October when the days are getting short, and the waiting has a particular quality to it, a quality of patience, of something that has always happened about to happen again. The aspens came up gold out of the dark. I have been sitting here ever since, and I am sitting here now. And I am telling you this the way my mother told me, quietly and without apology, because you have a right to know that the world is more full than you were told. The photograph of Fernand is on the kitchen table. He is shielding his eyes from the sun, standing in front of the birch trees, and he is trying to smile and not quite managing it. And he looks like a man who would have known the names of the trees and the birds and the creeks, a man who would have been comfortable in the forest and would not have been afraid of it. I think that matters. I think that is something. Biscuit has been awake for a few minutes now, looking at the window in the particular way he looks at the window in October, ears lifted, tail still, the posture of an old dog who knows something is near without being troubled by the knowing. I will sit here a little longer. The aspens are gold, and the spruce behind them is dark, and the sun is coming up over the ridge now, laying light across the frost on the grass, and the tree line is exactly as it has always been, exactly as my mother left it, which is standing and full, and more than it appears to be. She said she believed it would keep coming. I believe her.